I stood near the back of the funeral home during my stepdaughter's father's service, a man I'd never met, watching relatives I barely knew whisper to each other while glancing in my direction, careful enough to keep their voices low, but not quite careful enough to hide it entirely. I caught fragments. Isn't he just the second husband? He's not actually family, is he? One cousin, apparently unaware I could hear her clearly across the quiet room, asked another whether I even had a right to sit in the family section at all. I'd raised that woman's daughter, my stepdaughter Michelle, since she was 6 years old. I want to tell you what that whispered afternoon actually revealed, and what I eventually did about a question of belonging that had apparently been quietly unresolved for over 2 decades. I married Michelle's mother, Louise, when Michelle was 6, her biological father having left before she turned 2, largely absent from her life, beyond irregular child support payments, and occasional, unpredictable visits. I coached high school football for 30 years, a career that gave me summers largely free and afternoons flexible enough to attend nearly every school event Michelle ever had: science fairs, parent-teacher conferences, the ordinary accumulated presence of an actual engaged father, regardless of what any birth certificate technically stated. I coached her own softball team for 3 years when she was in middle school, taught her to drive in an empty parking lot on weekend mornings, walked her down the aisle at her wedding 11 years ago when her biological father, invited out of politeness, didn't bother showing up at all. I never tried to erase her biological father from her life story, understanding that pretending he didn't exist would serve nobody. But in every practical, daily sense that actually shapes a childhood, I was her father, a role Michelle herself, throughout her entire adult life, has never once questioned or qualified. Michelle's biological father passed unexpectedly, and despite everything, she wanted to attend his service, understanding him as a complicated, absent figure but still, undeniably, part of her origin story. I went with her for support, understanding my role that day would be peripheral, present for Michelle rather than for any grief of my own about a man I'd genuinely never met. I didn't expect that peripheral presence to become, itself, the subject of quiet scrutiny from relatives I'd never encountered before. I want to describe those whispers in more detail, because the specific words mattered as much as the general fact of feeling excluded. Beyond the second husband comment, I overheard a more pointed remark from an aunt I later learned was Michelle's biological father's sister, suggesting that my presence in the family section was presumptuous, that whatever relationship I'd built with Michelle over 2 decades didn't entitle me to sit among blood relatives at this particular service. I told Michelle what I'd overheard during a quiet moment outside the service, uncertain whether to burden her with it given everything else she was processing that day. I debated for nearly 20 minutes, standing near my car in the parking lot, whether telling her at all was fair given the emotional weight she was already carrying, ultimately deciding that keeping it from her felt like its own kind of dishonesty about what the day had actually contained for both of us. "How?" She was furious, more furious than I'd seen her in years, immediately wanting to confront the whispering relatives directly. I asked her not to, understanding that a confrontation at her own father's funeral would create a different, more lasting kind of family conflict than the quiet hurt I'd already absorbed. She grabbed my hand, right there in the parking lot, and told me plainly that whatever those relatives believed about blood and legitimacy, she considered me her actual father, full stop, and that their whispered opinion carried absolutely no weight against 20 years of lived reality. I remember being moved considerably more by her spontaneous certainty in that moment than by anything I could have said in my own defense. I don't remember much of the actual drive home from that funeral, only the specific, quiet ache of hearing my entire relationship with Michelle reduced, by strangers, to a technicality about blood, rather than the 2 decades of actual daily presence that had built something I'd always assumed was unquestionably real. I found myself wondering, uncomfortably, whether other family members over the years, people I'd assumed accepted me fully, harbored similar unspoken reservations they'd simply never voiced directly in my presence. I remember specifically thinking about my own mother-in-law, Luis's mother, wondering whether even her warm, consistent affection over the years had carried some quiet reservation I'd simply never been perceptive enough to notice. A paranoid line of thinking I recognized as unproductive even as I found myself unable to fully set it aside during that raw, difficult drive. I specifically thought about Michelle's wedding, replaying faces from that day, wondering which relatives, smiling politely as I walked her down the aisle, might have privately held some version of the same reservation those funeral relatives had voiced aloud. That particular exercise in retroactive doubt served no useful purpose. I understood even as I indulged it, but I couldn't quite stop myself from running through it during that difficult drive home. I spent the following weeks in a specific kind of quiet doubt I hadn't experienced in years, questioning relationships I'd long considered settled, wondering how many people at Michelle's own wedding, watching me walk her down the aisle, had privately held the same presumptuous judgment those funeral relatives had voiced aloud. I didn't share much of this doubt with Louise or Michelle directly, not wanting to burden either of them with an insecurity that felt, in its rawest moments, almost embarrassing for a 70-year-old man to still be carrying. I remember a specific evening during those weeks, sitting alone in my garage under the pretense of organizing tools I hadn't touched in months, actually simply needing somewhere private to sit with feelings I wasn't ready to name out loud yet, even to myself. I'd spent 30 years coaching teenage boys through difficult emotions, and found myself, at 70, genuinely struggling to apply that same guidance to my own quiet crisis of belonging. I eventually confided in my own biological son from a previous marriage, David, someone I trusted, to hear the full weight of what those whispers had actually done to me. David reminded me of something I'd genuinely forgotten in the raw hurt of that afternoon. That Michelle herself had never once, across 20 years, treated our relationship as anything less than completely real, and that the whispered judgment of relatives who'd barely known either of us mattered considerably less than the actual, lived truth Michelle and I had built together daily. David also told me something else that stayed with me, mentioning that he himself, my biological son, had watched me show up for Michelle with the exact same consistency I'd shown him growing up, and that he'd never once, in 20 years, perceived any difference in how genuinely I loved either of them. Hearing that specific observation from my own blood son, someone with every reason to notice if my attention had ever favored one child over the other, mattered more to me than I expected it to. Around this same period, already considering retirement from coaching, Louise and I began seriously researching retiring somewhere our combined modest pensions could stretch further, ultimately settling on the Philippines after months of careful comparison. I want to be honest that the funeral experience, while not the primary driver of this decision, added its own quiet motivation, a desire to build something new and deliberately chosen, rather than continuing to exist within a family structure where my belonging had apparently been silently questioned by people I'd never even met. Louise and I spent nearly 5 months researching carefully, treating the decision with the same discipline I'd once applied to building a football program, verifying visa requirements, comparing healthcare access, and confirming our combined pensions would genuinely stretch comfortably rather than simply adequately. I wanted this decision to be sound on its own financial merits, regardless of whatever emotional motivation had partly inspired the initial research. I remember spreading out spreadsheets on our dining room table most evenings during that research period, Louise cross-referencing healthcare facilities while I verified visa documentation requirements, both of us treating the decision with a seriousness that, looking back, was as much about reclaiming a sense of deliberate control after that disorienting funeral as it was about the financial planning itself. Louise and I moved 14 months after that funeral, settling into a coastal community with genuine warmth from local neighbors who never once questioned the legitimacy of any relationship in our lives, simply accepting us as we presented ourselves. I remember, Specifically, introducing myself to our first neighbor here as Michelle's father without a single moment's hesitation. A small but genuinely liberating act after months of feeling that specific title required some kind of internal justification before I could state it plainly. I built a standing weekly gathering with several other retirees, men who'd become, within months, a genuine chosen family of their own, friendship built entirely on present daily connection rather than any bloodline technicality. I remember the specific irony of that new friendship group, several of us joking, more than once, that we'd become each other's chosen brothers in a way none of our actual biological siblings back home had ever quite managed. A small but pointed reminder that genuine family, in my continued experience, had very little to do with shared blood and everything to do with sustained, chosen presence. Michelle visited 6 months after our move, and during that visit told me something that meant more to me than any reassurance could have back home. She said watching me build this new life, entirely on my own terms, had made her understand more clearly than ever how completely I'd always chosen her, repeatedly, deliberately, regardless of what any birth certificate said. I remember picking her up from the airport that visit, watching her scan the arrivals area before finding me, and the specific way her face lit up wasn't different in any single detail from every other reunion across the 20 years I'd been showing up for her. That ordinary, unremarkable consistency, more than any grand gesture either of us could have manufactured, was its own quiet answer to everything those funeral relatives had whispered. She also told me she'd finally confronted that whispering aunt, months after the funeral, informing her plainly that questioning my place in the family was, in effect, questioning Michelle's own father, full stop, regardless of biology. Michelle described that confrontation in detail during her visit, telling me she'd approached her aunt calmly, but directly at a subsequent family gathering, explaining precisely why the whispered comments had been not just hurtful, but factually wrong about the actual shape of her own childhood. She said the aunt had seemed genuinely surprised by the pushback, apparently having assumed her private opinion carried no real consequence simply because it had been delivered quietly rather than directly to my face. I've come to understand, with some real distance from that funeral now, that the whispers said considerably more about those specific relatives' narrow understanding of family than about anything genuinely lacking in my relationship with Michelle. Chosen family, built through decades of actual daily presence, isn't a lesser category requiring justification against blood relatives who often did considerably less actual parenting. I stopped needing external validation for something Michelle and I both already knew was completely real. I've also come to understand something about my own defensive posture in the immediate aftermath, recognizing, with some distance now, that seeking that external validation at all reflected an old, unexamined assumption on my own part, that blood relationships somehow carried inherent authority to judge chosen ones, an assumption I'd apparently absorbed somewhere along the way, despite my own 30 years of direct evidence contradicting it, through my relationship with Michelle. I think that unexamined assumption is worth naming plainly, because I suspect it's more common than most people admit, even among those of us who've spent years actively building chosen family relationships. There's a specific, quiet cultural default that treats blood as the baseline legitimacy against which everything else must prove itself, rather than treating demonstrated commitment as its own independent, sufficient standard. Unlearning that default, even after 30 years of my own contradicting evidence, took a whispered funeral comment to finally force into conscious view. If you've built a genuine parental relationship without a biological claim and faced similar quiet questioning from relatives measuring belonging purely by blood, I want to tell you what this experience taught me. Their whispers reflect their own limited framework, not any actual deficiency in what you've built. The relationship's realness was proven, daily, across every ordinary moment you actually showed up, not by anyone's willingness to formally acknowledge it at a funeral. I'd also encourage you not to internalize their narrow definition as though it carries any actual authority over your own lived experience, however painful the whispered moment itself might feel. I spent several weeks doing exactly that internalizing before David's reminder helped me recognize the doubt as borrowed from strangers rather than genuinely earned through anything lacking in my actual relationship with Michelle. If you find yourself, like I did, running through old memories searching for evidence that might validate a stranger's casual judgment, I'd encourage you to notice that impulse clearly and set it aside deliberately, the same way I eventually learned to. The evidence you're searching for already exists, abundantly. In every ordinary day you actually showed up. It doesn't require relitigating against a single whispered afternoon from people who witnessed none of it. I think about that funeral home often. Still, the specific sting of hearing 2 decades of genuine fatherhood reduced to a technicality by strangers who knew nothing of the actual relationship they were casually dismissing. If you're facing your own version of that whispered doubt, I hope you find the same clarity I eventually did, that the people who actually lived the relationship with you are the only ones whose verdict genuinely matters, regardless of what anyone else quietly murmurs from the back of a room. Michelle called last week, mentioning that her aunt had reached out recently, tentatively, asking to reconnect after nearly 2 years of distance following that confrontation. Michelle told her she was welcome to reconnect, but only if she was ready to genuinely accept the full shape of her family, blood and chosen alike, rather than quietly ranking one above the other. I don't know yet how that particular relationship will resolve, but I found myself, hearing about it, genuinely proud of the boundary Michelle had set. Not out of anger, but out of the same clear-eyed understanding of real family that I'd like to think, across 3 decades, I helped teach her by example rather than lecture. That old note is still folded in my wallet, worn soft at the creases now from 2 years of being carried alongside my usual cards. Substance outlasts title. I believe it fully now, not just as coaching wisdom borrowed for my own situation, but as the simplest, truest account of what Michelle and I actually built, one ordinary day at a time, regardless of whoever whispered otherwise. I'll see you in the next one. I spent 30 years teaching teenage boys a specific lesson about earned respect versus assumed status, that a captain's armband didn't automatically confer leadership, that real authority on a team came from consistent, demonstrated commitment rather than any title alone. It took me embarrassingly long, sitting in that garage during those difficult weeks, to apply the exact same principle to my own situation. I'd spent 3 decades teaching 17-year-olds that titles without substance mean nothing, and real substance without formal title still means everything. Somehow, at 70, I'd briefly forgotten to extend myself the same clarity I'd offered so many locker rooms full of teenagers over the years. Once that realization actually landed, genuinely, rather than just intellectually, much of the lingering doubt from that funeral began loosening its grip. I'd spent 2 decades demonstrating exactly the kind of substance I'd always told my players mattered most. No whispered technicality about a birth certificate could actually undo that record. I actually wrote this exact realization down, that evening in the garage, on the back of an old practice schedule I found in a drawer, a small note to myself I still keep folded in my wallet here. Substance outlasts title. You've always coached that, now believe it about yourself. I don't know that I needed the physical reminder as much as I needed the act of writing it, forcing the insight out of my head and into something concrete enough to actually hold on to during the harder days that followed. I want to mention my wife's own perspective on all this, because I think it matters as much as anyone else's in this story. Louise told me, during one of those difficult evenings, that she'd married me specifically because of how completely I'd committed to Michelle from our very first months together, long before any wedding made our own relationship official. She said watching those funeral relatives question something she'd witnessed, built with such obvious patient dedication, felt almost absurd to her, like watching strangers argue about the color of a sky she'd spent 20 years looking at directly. Her specific certainty, delivered plainly, rather than as simple reassurance, did more to settle my own doubt than almost anything else during that difficult period. She also reminded me, gently, that she'd chosen to build a life with a man who showed up fully for a child who wasn't biologically his, and that this exact quality, so casually dismissed by relatives at a funeral, was in fact one of the primary reasons she'd fallen in love with me in the first place. She told me this while we sat on our small back porch here, watching the evening settle over the neighborhood we'd chosen together, and I remember feeling, in that specific moment, something close to the same clarity I'd once felt standing in our old kitchen, watching 6-year-old Michelle call me Dad for the first time, without any prompting. 2 decades apart, 2 entirely different settings, but the same fundamental truth underneath both moments, that the family we'd actually built, day by ordinary day, had never needed anyone else's permission or validation to be completely real.